The night is quiet, yet the silence of history weighs more heavily than any stillness of the air. Long before modern maps divided the world into tidy nations, long before borders were drawn and flags planted, the cartographers of Europe described something different. Across the parchment of the 17th and 18th centuries, one name stretched with certainty across half of Asia: Tartaria. To the makers of maps, it was undeniable. On the grand wall charts of Joan Bleu in Amsterdam, on the atlases of Guillaume de Lille in Paris, and even on the maps carried by British explorers venturing eastward, the word Tartaria sprawled across Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, and beyond. Sometimes it was labelled Great Tartary, other times subdivided into Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, or Muscovite Tartary. Yet the scale of the name was consistent. It covered a landmass greater than the United States and Europe combined. Open the Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1771 and you will still find an entry on Tartary. It speaks of a vast country, of its people divided into tribes, of its enormous reach. This was no minor label. For the educated classes of Europe, Tartaria was as familiar a term as Persia or Prussia. Geographical treatises of the Enlightenment echoed it again and again. The maps of Vincenzo Coronelli, the Italian cosmographer, showed it. So too did the Jesuit reports from China, who often referred to the northern lands as belonging to Tartary. For generations, the name was part of the shared vocabulary of scholars, diplomats, and travellers. And then it disappeared. By the middle of the 19th century, the word had been erased. The maps changed, their wide sweeps of Tartaria replaced with precise divisions, Siberia as part of the Russian Empire, Mongolia as its own land. Xinjiang folded into the territory of the Qing dynasty. Encyclopedias removed the entry. Textbooks quietly omitted the name. The transition was not marked as a discovery or a correction. It was simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. This sudden erasure leaves behind a question too large to ignore. If Tartaria was merely a careless label, why did it persist so long and in so many respected works? If it was only the invention of Europeans who misunderstood Asia, why did encyclopedias describe its regions and boundaries in detail? And if it was real, if Tartaria was in some sense a coherent entity, how could something so vast collapse into silence without the world taking notice? Consider the atlases side by side. A map printed in 1700 bears the word Tartaria in bold, stretching across a continent. Next to it, a map from 1850 shows instead the neat grid of modern nations. The lands themselves have not changed, the mountains and rivers remain as they always were, but the ink has shifted. One world has been removed and another has been installed in its place. The disappearance is not just geographical, but perceptual. An entire civilization, or at least the idea of one, has been folded away between editions. Who carried out this erasure and why? Official history tends to explain it away. Scholars argue that Tartary was always a vague, imprecise term, a convenient label for the distant and little-known steppes beyond Europe's direct experience. Once Russian explorers charted Siberia more thoroughly, and once Qing China consolidated its western frontiers, the term became unnecessary. Thus, it was quietly retired. This is the conventional view, that Tartaria vanished not because it was erased, but because knowledge advanced. Yet this explanation does not silence the deeper unease. If Tartary was only a vague label, why did it endure so consistently for centuries? Why did respected encyclopedias treat it as a real entity? Why did European scholars bother to divide it into sub-regions, to assign it borders and characteristics? And why, when the term was discarded, was it done without explanation, as if its very memory was to be expunged? Some theorists suggest the disappearance was deliberate. Empires, after all, have long relied on rewriting the past to justify their dominance. If there once existed a power stretching across the steppes, vast, sophisticated, and perhaps technologically advanced, its memory might have threatened the legitimacy of rising states. Better to erase it, to fold its traces into the narratives of Russia, China, or the Mongols, than to admit to a heritage too immense to control. The silence becomes more haunting when we remember how history often leaves shadows. Cities half buried beneath soil, windows sunk below the ground, ruins that no one can fully explain. Symbols carved into stone whose meaning is forgotten. Old chronicles that mention kingdoms which official history no longer acknowledges. Perhaps Tartaria is one more of these shadows. An erased empire whose traces still remain for those willing to search. Accounts from travellers hint at this strangeness. Marco Polo, journeying through Asia, described the Tatars as a people of great power and reach. Jesuit missionaries in China noted vast northern lands they called Tartary. Even the official records of the Russian Empire sometimes referred to its newly conquered eastern lands as Siberian Tartary. The persistence of the name across such different voices suggests that Tartaria was more than a cartographic accident. If we accept that erasure can be intentional, then Tartaria's disappearance invites unsettling questions. Was its removal a simple adjustment in language, or was it part of a conscious effort to suppress memory? Who gained by ensuring that the name Tartaria would be forgotten? And what truths might have been folded away with it? Tonight we begin with this: a vanished word, a missing chapter. The ink of old maps whispers of a world once recognized and now denied. The chronicles of encyclopedias hint at an empire that official history has erased. What evidence might still survive of this lost presence, and what does its silence reveal about the story we have inherited? The silence in history is rarely empty. What appears to be a blank page often conceals the faint traces of something written before, erased but not entirely gone. When we look at Tartaria, we find ourselves standing at the edge of one of these silences, a void in the chronicles where an empire once seemed to exist. And in that void, shadows linger. History is not only what survives, it is also what has been chosen. For every civilization celebrated in textbooks, there are countless others reduced to fragments, misnamed, or forgotten. The process is rarely innocent. Powers rise and fall, and with them new stories are written. To secure authority, a ruler does not merely conquer land, he conquers memory. And once memory is conquered, the past itself can be reshaped. Tartaria fits into this larger pattern. Think of the many civilizations whose names have slipped into obscurity. In Mesopotamia, entire cities like Lagash and Mari were buried for millennia, their existence reduced to rumour until archaeologists unearthed them. The Hittites, once dismissed as biblical myth, were rediscovered when their capital emerged from the soil of Anatolia. Even the Maya, whose temples now rise majestically from jungles, were long spoken of as mysterious ruins by Europeans who ignored the living descendants around them. Each time, silence stood in place of recognition until someone chose to look again. But with Tartaria, the silence feels different. It is not the silence of ruins swallowed by nature. It is not the silence of names preserved only in myth. It is a silence curated in documents, a deliberate fading from maps, from encyclopedias, from the academic record. A silence imposed by rewriting, and that makes it stranger. Why would a name once so widely used be allowed to vanish without debate? Why would scholars abandon it all at once, with barely a trace of explanation? The abruptness feels less like natural forgetting and more like a conscious decision. Was it to simplify geography, or was it to bury an inconvenient legacy? The deeper one looks, the more patterns appear. Tartaria's disappearance coincides with the rise of empires hungry to expand their influence. Russia was consolidating Siberia. The Qing dynasty was extending its grasp into the west. Britain was mapping the world to feed its colonial appetite. In such a climate, a vast and undefined entity called Tartaria was an obstacle. Better to carve it into pieces, to label its lands with new names, to fold its memory into narratives that suited the powers of the day. And so Tartaria became a ghost in the record. Not a ruin one could excavate, not a myth one could decode, but a silence maintained by the weight of authority. In its place, new histories were written. The Russian Empire claimed the north, China claimed the east. Mongolia was recast as a rugged periphery, Each fragment took on a life of its own, and the larger whole was forgotten. Yet erasures never hold completely. In old maps, the name still stares back. In the margins of encyclopedias, faint entries remain. In travellers' journals, the word appears like an echo. And it is in these fragments that the ghost of Tartaria survives. What are we to make of these shadows? Are they the remnants of a real empire, a legacy suppressed by new rulers? Or are they signs of how memory itself can be shaped, how names can be made to appear and disappear according to the will of power? The silence does not answer. It only invites us deeper, to trace the contours of what has been erased. If history can be folded so easily, what else might lie hidden between its lines? And if Tartaria is only one example of this deliberate silence, how many other empires, how many other legacies might be waiting in the shadows, erased but not entirely gone? If these questions keep you awake with wonder, let the quiet of the night guide you further. And if you feel drawn to mysteries like this, consider subscribing. Together we can follow the whispers of what history tried to erase. Where are you listening from tonight, and what hour has found you there? To confront Tartaria is to confront a paradox. It is everywhere in the records of the past, yet nowhere in the narratives of the present. It should not exist, and yet the maps, books, and chronicles insist that it once did. What are we to make of a presence so boldly declared and so thoroughly erased? In the great atlases of the 17th and 18th centuries, Tartaria was not drawn as a minor province or a distant periphery. It was vast, a land stretching across thousands of miles, coloured in broad swathes of ink that gave it weight and permanence. Travellers recorded it in their journals, missionaries referred to it in their letters, merchants wrote of crossing its endless steppes. The word itself was not unusual, not exotic. It was a term that scholars, explorers, and rulers all recognised. And yet in our age, when one searches for Tartaria, the answers dissolve. Official history tells us it was never an empire, merely a vague name used by Europeans to describe the nomadic peoples of Central and Northern Asia. According to this view, Tartaria was no more real than Christendom or the Orient, a convenient label for outsiders, not a civilization in its own right. But the evidence does not sit comfortably with this dismissal. Why would encyclopedias of the Enlightenment describe Tartary in the same breath as other established powers? Why would mapmakers divide it into distinct regions if it was only a vague abstraction? Why would reports of Tartaria endure across centuries, echoed from London to Paris to Rome, if it had no substance at all? It is here that suspicion takes root. Perhaps Tartaria was not merely a careless label. Perhaps it was something more. A presence that resisted easy classification and therefore became a threat to the narratives that later prevailed. An empire that did not fit the story of how nations were supposed to rise and fall. An empire that should not exist. Consider how history treats inconvenient truths. When a legacy cannot be fully denied, it is often redefined. The Huns become raiders instead of rulers. The Phoenicians become traders rather than innovators. The Scythians are cast as savages, though their art suggests a culture both intricate and symbolic. Could Tartaria have suffered the same fate? An empire reduced to a label, its people dismissed as nomads, its achievements scattered among others? The silence of modern scholarship only deepens the unease. Tartaria does not appear in academic histories, not because it was disproven, but because it was never acknowledged in the first place. Its absence is not the result of evidence weighed and rejected. It is the result of questions never asked. And in that absence, the traces grow stranger. Architecture that seems too advanced for its time, standing in regions once labelled Tartary. Folklore that speaks of rulers and realms now without a name. Maps that linger in archives, still bearing the bold letters across the heart of Asia. Each of these fragments suggests that Tartaria was more than a shadow, that it was once a presence strong enough to demand recognition. But what kind of empire was it? Was Tartaria a unified civilization, stretching across steppes and forests with cities and rulers unknown to us? Or was it something different, a network of cultures bound together by trade, by technology, by an inheritance that later empires sought to divide. The evidence does not resolve the question. It only multiplies the possibilities, and perhaps that is why Tartaria had to vanish. For an empire that should not exist, the most effective way to deal with it is to erase it, leaving behind only fragments that can be explained away. And so the paradox remains, a presence written across centuries of records, now absent from the history we are taught. Tartaria should not exist, yet it lingers in ink, in stone, in whispers. If Tartaria defies the narratives of history, then what other traces of its presence might be hidden in plain sight? And what secrets lie waiting in the structures it left behind? If Tartaria existed, it would have left traces not only in maps and chronicles, but in the very stones that surround us. Architecture, after all, is the most stubborn witness of history. Empires may fall, names may be erased, but stone endures. And when we look at the structures scattered across Europe, Asia, and even the Americas, we find echoes of something that feels too advanced, too mysterious for the explanations we are given. Walk through the great cities of the Old World and you will see them. Cathedrals whose domes rise like celestial orbs, star forts etched into the earth with geometric precision, sprawling complexes whose symmetry seems to echo cosmic patterns rather than human improvisation. Many of these buildings are attributed to the architects of the Renaissance or the engineers of the Enlightenment, yet the sheer scale and intricacy often seem to belong to something older, something forgotten. The star forts, in particular, whisper of Tartaria. These fortifications, with their perfect polygonal shapes and radiating bastions, appear across continents. From the Netherlands to India, from Russia to the Americas, they follow a design so consistent it suggests a single knowledge shared across the world. Historians explain them as a European military innovation, but the spread is suspiciously wide, the construction suspiciously advanced. Could these be remnants of Tartarian influence? A lost science of geometry and defense, too easily dismissed as coincidence? Then there are the great domes and spires, structures like St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, the intricate towers of Samarkand, or the unexpected grandeur of buildings in remote Siberian towns. Their ornate detail and improbable scale raise the same question. Were these truly the works of local craftsmen, suddenly producing masterpieces beyond their tradition, or were they inheritances, monuments built upon older foundations, rebranded by later rulers? Some claim that these buildings contain clues to technologies now forgotten, domes that resonate like vast tuning chambers, towers aligned with the stars, designs that channel energy rather than merely decorate. The idea may sound strange, yet the consistency of the motifs cannot be ignored. Across distant lands, similar forms appear, as though guided by a hidden template. If Tartaria was indeed erased, perhaps its greatest vulnerability was also its greatest pride, its architecture. For unlike maps and texts, stone cannot be erased with a stroke of the pen. It must be redefined. A cathedral is said to be Russian, a mosque declared Islamic, a fort attributed to colonial engineers. The names change, the stories change, but the stones remain, silent, enduring, carrying with them a whisper of another origin. And so the towers rise, impossible in their persistence. Each one is a question carved into the skyline. Who truly built this? With what knowledge and for what purpose? If these monuments belong to Tartaria, then they are not merely relics. They are evidence that the empire's reach was global, its knowledge profound, and its erasure deliberate. But if architecture holds the memory of Tartaria, then perhaps it also hides its secrets more deeply. What if beneath the domes and forts lie not only forgotten stones, but forgotten machines? Technologies veiled as ornament, waiting to be recognized once more. What secrets might these towers of impossible stone conceal within their walls? And what story might they tell if we learn to listen? If architecture is stone given a voice, then technology is thought given breath. In the whispers of Tartaria, the two converge. Stone and machine, faith and function, ornament and utility blending until they are indistinguishable. To the eye trained by modern textbooks, these whispers are dismissed as fantasy. But if we listen with patience, if we look closely at the monuments that stand around us, a different possibility begins to emerge. That Tartaria was not only an empire of land and power, but of knowledge. Knowledge written in the language of lost machines. The idea is sometimes called Antiquitech, technology hidden within plain sight, disguised as architecture, explained away as decorative flourish. Across the great cities of the world, Moscow, Paris, Rome, Delhi, Beijing, Chicago, spires rise skyward, capped with metallic rods. Officially they are steeples, symbols pointing to heaven, or lightning conductors added for safety. Yet their placement is too deliberate, their repetition too universal. Could they have been something more? Antennas of a forgotten network, conductors not merely of lightning, but of atmospheric energy itself? Consider the domes, vast copper-clad hemispheres crowning cathedrals, mosques, and government halls. Copper is not chosen by accident, it is one of the best conductors known to us. To the historian, these domes are symbols of authority or faith. To the skeptic, they may also be capacitors, vessels designed to store and redistribute electrical charge. Imagine an entire city as a machine, its buildings not only functional but interconnected, humming with energy drawn from the very air. Step into a cathedral and feel how sound moves. Voices echo not chaotically, but with resonance, as though the space itself were tuned. The organ's vibrations fill the hall, reverberating through stone and glass, shaking not only the body but something deeper. Was this merely designed for beauty, or did these spaces serve as harmonic chambers, instruments that amplified human intent and focused energy flows? Columns might be conduits, domes, capacitors, stained glass, filters of frequency. Where we see sacred ornament, Tartaria might have seen engineering. The traces do not end with architecture. Old engravings from the 18th and 19th centuries depict street scenes alive with technologies that do not fit their time. Horse-drawn carriages appear without visible harnesses. Towers glow as though lit from within, long before electric grids were supposedly widespread. Lampposts without wires stand in rows, yet shine in illustrations with steady light. Fountains are drawn spewing vast torrents of water without any obvious source of pressure. Are these simply artistic liberties, or glimpses into a world where energy was free, abundant, drawn from the earth and sky rather than mined from coal? Even in ruins, anomalies remain. In certain fortresses, stone has been fused into glass, as if exposed to a heat beyond what fire or cannon could produce. In Siberia, metallic alloys have been found embedded in ancient constructions, their composition difficult to replicate even with modern methods. Legends from the steppes speak of crystals that glowed in the night, of towers that sang when storms approached, of instruments buried beneath mud and ice that could summon winds or calm them. These fragments suggest machines not of gears and pistons, but of resonance and energy. Machines that blurred the line between natural and artificial, between physics and myth. The mud floods add another layer of intrigue. If entire cities were indeed buried in sudden deluges of earth, what else was entombed beneath? There are photographs from the 19th century of excavated buildings where lower floors remain filled with compacted soil as though sealed in haste. What machinery might lie hidden in those forgotten basements, bricked over before it could be explained? What devices mistaken for ornament might still sleep beneath our feet? To accept the possibility of Tartarian machines is to confront the reason for their erasure. For if such devices once existed, if energy could be drawn from the air, if water could be pumped endlessly without fuel, if resonance could heal or destroy with equal ease, then the suppression of Tartaria was not merely political. It was practical. Knowledge of such magnitude threatens every structure of control. A civilization that needs no coal, no oil, no hierarchy of supply and demand is a civilization that cannot be ruled by scarcity. To erase Tartaria would be to erase the memory of freedom itself. Historians call these interpretations pseudoscience, born of misreading ornament or misinterpreting art. And perhaps they are right. Yet the questions refuse to vanish. Why are so many monuments aligned with precision to magnetic north? Why do domes and spires mirror the design of known resonant chambers? Why did so many temporary wonders of the 19th century, colossal exposition halls, palaces of glass and light, appear suddenly, built at impossible speed, and then vanish, dismantled before their secrets could be studied? The silence deepens the suspicion. It is one thing for ruins to crumble, another for them to be erased from memory. The language of Tartaria's machines may still be here, etched into stone, cast in metal, encoded in geometry, but without the key, we cannot read it. Like a score without its music, we see the notes but cannot hear the symphony. And so we are left to wonder, were these machines real? And if so, what might they reveal if uncovered? Would they liberate us, offering abundance and healing beyond measure? Or would they unleash forces long forgotten, dangerous without the wisdom of those who first wielded them? Perhaps the truth lies not in proving or disproving, but in listening. For even in silence, the towers still hum when the wind is right. The domes still catch the sun and shimmer as if alive. The ruins still glow faintly in the storms. They wait, like language without a reader, like machines without an operator, holding within them the memory of Tartaria. And in that memory, a question lingers. If the empire of machines still breathes quietly through our world, how long before we recognize its voice again? And are we ready to understand what it will say? History, when read closely, is not a calm river flowing from origin to destination. It is jagged, broken, filled with fractures where entire civilizations appear, flourish, and then vanish, leaving only silence behind. We are taught to imagine the past as a steady progression, tribe to kingdom, kingdom to empire, empire to nation. But look carefully, and that story unravels. Great cultures have risen suddenly, only to collapse as if swept away by forces too vast to resist. Floods, plagues, fires, invasions, each serves as a convenient explanation, but behind them is a deeper pattern, one that recurs across myth and memory, the pattern of resets. Tartaria, if it truly existed, may have been caught in such a cycle, undone not by slow decline, but by a reset of world-shaping magnitude. Every culture carries its own vision of these resets. The Bible describes a deluge that swallowed Noah's generation. Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, vast ages that end in chaos and destruction before a new one begins. The Hopi tell of previous worlds destroyed by fire and flood, leaving only a remnant to begin again. The Aztecs believed we live in the fifth sun, the fifth world, because the four before it were all consumed by catastrophe. The Norse tell of Ragnarok, when fire and ice will devour creation, and then life will return anew. Myths echo across continents. Time is not linear, it is cyclical, and each cycle ends with an upheaval that sweeps the slate clean. Modern science, though more cautious in tone, tells a strangely similar story. The eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE shattered the Minoan world and echoed in the myth of Atlantis. Around 536 CE, volcanic ash veiled the earth, crops failed, empires faltered, and the year without summer became a global trauma. In 1815, Tambora's eruption plunged the planet into darkness, reshaping societies across continents. More recently, scientists speak of younger Dryas impacts, meteor strikes, and sudden climate reversals that nearly ended human civilization. The pattern is clear. Catastrophe interrupts history, not gently, but with violence, tearing out entire chapters of human memory. Could Tartaria have been one of these erased chapters? Not simply conquered by an empire, but obliterated by a cataclysm, its ruins buried, its story stolen, its very name reduced to a footnote that was later erased? Among alternative histories, one theory repeats like an incantation: the mud flood. Not a flood of water, but of earth itself. Entire cities, they say, were buried suddenly, their ground floors swallowed beneath thick layers of soil, their lower windows entombed. Old photographs from the 19th century show structures with entrances beneath street level, grand buildings that appear as though the ground rose up overnight. Official explanations insist that streets were raised over centuries, or that architects built into slopes. But to those who see with different eyes, these anomalies are evidence of a catastrophe that smothered the old world beneath mud, leaving survivors to build atop the ruins and call them their own. If such a flood occurred, its consequences would have been unimaginable. Libraries of knowledge drowned in silence. Machines, whatever technology Tartaria may have held, entombed beyond recovery. Cities transformed overnight into mausoleums. For the survivors, the world would have seemed new, stripped of its memory. And for those who inherited the ruins, it would have been an opportunity. Claim the stones, rename the streets, attribute the structures to new builders. With the past buried in mud, the story could be written afresh. This notion aligns too neatly with what followed. By the 19th century, as the mud flood whispers, the vast name of Tartaria had dissolved. Its lands were divided between Russia, China, and emerging nation-states. Its monuments were attributed to new empires. Its people were rebranded as tribes and provinces. Silence took the place of memory. Was this coincidence, or the aftermath of disaster, natural or engineered, exploited by those who came after? The compelling force of the mud flood idea lies not only in architecture, but in myth's universality. Time and again, we hear of worlds destroyed and remade. Atlantis sank beneath the sea. The Indus cities fell beneath fire and flood. The Maya described earlier worlds, each annihilated before theirs was born. The Hopi tell of ant people sheltering humanity underground until the flood passed. Why should Tartaria be different? Its erasure feels less like anomaly and more like continuation. Another civilization folded into the endless rhythm of resets. Yet if Tartaria was a victim of such a reset, what does that suggest about our own time? History does not grant immunity. If whole empires can be erased in a single generation, if memory itself can be smothered beneath mud and silence, what does that say about the fragility of our present world? We assume permanence, yet the ground beneath us is restless, the sky above us uncertain. Could the silence that swallowed Tartaria return, not as a story from the past, but as a fate waiting in the future? The possibility unsettles the night. It forces us to see history not as progress, but as cycle. Cycles that rise with brilliance, collapse into ruin, and leave behind fragments for those who come next to interpret. Each cycle wipes the slate clean, burying not only empires, but the very memory that they existed. We inherit their silence, mistaking it for absence. And so we return to the question that refuses to close. If Tartaria was truly erased by catastrophe, what fragments of that buried world still wait beneath our feet? What forgotten machines? What sealed rooms? What silent knowledge rests under layers of earth, waiting for a moment when the ground shifts and the past breathes again? If Tartaria truly collapsed in a great reset, the evidence of that collapse should linger somewhere in the world around us. Traces of disaster rarely disappear entirely. They seep into the landscape, into ruins, into the small anomalies that survive the rewriting of history. And so, attention turns to one of the strangest anomalies of all, the so-called mud flood. The mystery begins with photographs from the 19th and early 20th centuries. In city after city, grand buildings rise proudly, their facades ornate and towering, yet something appears strangely wrong. Windows sit far below the level of the street, half buried in soil. Doorways open directly into the ground, as though the earth had risen up to meet them. In some places, streets descend into what look like cellars, but those cellars bear evidence of once being the original ground floor. Builders and masons provide tidy explanations. Streets are raised over time, they say, foundations settle, architects built into slopes. Yet the consistency is uncanny. From St. Petersburg to Paris, from Chicago to San Francisco, the same pattern repeats. Majestic architecture whose lower stories have been swallowed by the earth. What if this was not merely urban planning, but the residue of catastrophe? According to alternative histories, a sudden deluge of mud engulfed entire cities during the 18th or 19th centuries, drowning their lower levels in a wave of earth. Survivors would have rebuilt atop the ruins, unwilling or unable to preserve the truth of what had happened. The evidence, they claim, lies not in obscure legends, but in plain sight. Windows you cannot reach, staircases that lead nowhere, facades half hidden beneath modern streets. Accounts from the time only deepen the unease. Old newspapers record earth waves and strange inundations that swept across regions following storms or earthquakes. Reports describe sudden swells of soil and silt, as though the ground itself had liquefied and surged through cities. Archaeologists have unearthed layers of compacted mud in places where no natural flooding should have occurred, suggesting deposition that was not slow but sudden. And in some buildings, entire lower levels remain sealed. Doors bricked shut, rooms filled with earth, their contents never excavated. These are not myths. They are features of the cities we still walk through, ignored by those who choose not to ask. The mud flood theory suggests that these buried structures were not isolated accidents, but part of a global event. The sheer distribution of anomalies is difficult to explain otherwise. Why do grand public buildings on different continents share the same strange, half-submerged appearance, all dating to the same broad era? Why are lower windows bricked over uniformly? Why do stairways climb awkwardly above what appears to have been the original ground? Skeptics insist these are results of urban evolution. Raised pavements, architectural fashion, centuries of rebuilding. And yet, if the explanation is so simple, why do official histories rarely address the pattern at all? Why is silence so often the response to the most visible of anomalies? If Tartaria was indeed erased, the mud flood becomes more than geology. It becomes a mechanism of erasure, a disaster, whether natural or engineered, that buried not only cities but their machines, their archives, their technologies. Once the flood had entombed the past, those who inherited the surface could write new histories. They could claim the architecture, rename the land, erase the memory. Cathedrals could be attributed to newer rulers. Star forts rebranded as colonial outposts, great halls explained away as products of more recent empires. The mud buried more than stone. It buried identity. And yet the half-buried windows remain like testimony, silent, unremarked, but stubbornly present. They speak of a fracture in time, a scar across human civilization that official history refuses to name. To walk the streets of these cities is to walk above two worlds, the one we inhabit and the one sealed below, entombed in silence. What lies in those buried rooms? Some say the machines of Tartaria, devices that drew power from the air, resonance chambers disguised as ornament, records of technologies long forgotten. Others imagine archives of chronicles, testimonies that would unravel the narratives we have been taught. Even a single unearthed chamber could transform our sense of history, yet most remain sealed, locked in darkness beneath layers of earth and denial. Skeptics warn against fantasy, but the question does not vanish. Why are these anomalies so widespread? Why are the lower levels of entire districts filled with mud, while official histories speak only of renovations? And why is the silence of scholarship so loud, the refusal to examine so insistent? Perhaps the true threat is not that mud floods never happened, but that they did, and that acknowledging them would reveal how fragile the stories of empire truly are. If mud floods conceal Tartaria's ruins, then perhaps beneath our streets lies the evidence of an empire erased. Every step may carry us above a buried world, one sealed deliberately from memory. And if one day those rooms are opened, if the soil is cleared and the doors unbricked, what might emerge? Forgotten machines, glowing crystals, chronicles of another age, or only silence, heavier than before, a silence that dares us to imagine what was lost. For now, we live in the world above, blind to the one below. But the facades half hidden in the earth are reminders that history is not as stable as we imagine. They are questions carved in stone, waiting patiently beneath our feet, and so the thought lingers. If these cities are graves for Tartaria's memory, how long can the earth keep its silence? And when the ground shifts once more, what buried truths will rise to meet us? Empires may vanish from maps, their names rubbed out of encyclopedias, and their borders redrawn by the victors. But the memory of what they were lingers elsewhere. It hides in the places history cannot easily erase. In song, in story, in the rituals whispered around fires, in the patterns sewn into cloth. If Tartaria was stripped from the written record, perhaps it survived in another form, as folklore spread across the endless steppes, as fragments carried unconsciously by the people who once belonged to it. For what is folklore, if not history disguised as story, preserved in the memory of those who refuse to forget? Across Siberia and Central Asia, strange echoes remain. The Evenki and Yakut tell of ancestors who dwelled in cities of light, towers that hummed with invisible power until the earth itself shook and consumed them. In the Altai, epics speak of golden cities swallowed by mud, their rulers spirited away into caverns beneath the mountains. Buryat tales recall a time when the sun was brighter, then stolen or dimmed, forcing the people to wander in search of its return. Among the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz, fragments of heroic poetry describe wars against sky beings, giants who hurled weapons that shattered mountains. These may sound like fantasy, but together they form a chorus. Different tongues, scattered peoples, yet motifs that align as though each were recalling the same broken memory. Even further west, in Russia's folklore, we hear of the Belovodya or White Water Land, sometimes described as a radiant hidden kingdom beyond the mountains, ruled by just and wise lords. Peasant tales call it the White Stone City, a capital of perfection, waiting for the worthy to rediscover it. In the Caucasus, legends speak of colossal fortresses buried beneath green hills, a memory that seems to echo the geometric star forts which dot maps but remain unexplained by official history. In Mongolia, the memory of Genghis Khan is shadowed by something older. Stories of empires that rose before him, rulers whose power seemed supernatural, as though he himself were only an echo of a deeper past. Could these be distorted reflections of Tartaria? When a civilization is erased, its history does not vanish. It bends, warps, becomes myth. It hides within the metaphors of story, like a dream half-remembered. Myths of vanished suns, of golden towers, of floods that smothered entire nations may not be imagination alone. They may be encoded recollections of Tartaria's fall, carefully folded into the fabric of legend, so that memory would survive even when the name was denied. Scholars often dismiss such tales as allegory. The sun stands for power, floods for chaos, giants for natural forces. Yet myths across the world converge too neatly to ignore. Every continent has flood stories. Cultures that never met describe giants or weapons of thunder. Cities drowned, buried, or hidden appear in every tradition. The pattern suggests less invention than remembrance. Perhaps what we call mythology is not the invention of poets, but the scar tissue of civilization. Memory wounded, memory transformed, but memory still. If Tartaria once lived, then its people did not vanish. They became scattered, absorbed into Russians, Mongols, Tatars, Kazakhs, Uzbeks. Their empire was erased, their name denied, but their memory endured in fragments. The lullabies of nomads echo with rhythms older than nations. The embroidery of Central Asian women carries symbols, suns, spirals, stars, whose meanings have long been forgotten, but whose presence endures. Festivals reenact rituals whose origins no one remembers, yet the motions repeat like instinct, preserving something that words cannot. These fragments are like seeds, scattered by wind, germinating quietly in cultures that outwardly have no connection to one another. Perhaps this is what it means to be the children of a vanished sun. To walk the earth carrying within your blood the memory of an empire unacknowledged, to sing songs whose meanings you no longer know, yet which carry echoes of cities lost beneath mud. To tell tales of rulers who wielded strange knowledge, though you call them giants or gods because the language of science was taken from you. The thought is haunting, that folklore may be the last testimony of Tartaria, surviving where history was silenced. That what we dismiss as story is in fact archive. That myth is not invention, but the encrypted code of erased civilizations. It raises a question that lingers like smoke. If the people of Tartaria live on, dispersed and renamed, then how much of their legacy do we unknowingly inherit? In the turn of a melody, in the symbol carved into a wooden beam, in the rhythm of a festival drum, how much of Tartaria still breathes? And if these myths are indeed windows, then what world lies beyond them, waiting to be seen when we dare to look? Could the children of a vanished sun be carrying within them not only memory, but also a summons? A reminder that the past is never truly buried, only disguised, waiting for recognition. The silence holds the answer, though it does not speak. Instead, it invites us to listen more carefully, to hear the resonance hidden in tales told by grandmothers, in epics sung across steppes, in the faded motifs of cloth and stone. For within those small survivals may lie the greatest secret, that Tartaria endures not on maps, but in the hearts of its descendants, in the myths of 1,000 tongues, in the echo of a vanished sun. And so the question lingers at the edge of night. If Tartaria still lives on in its children, scattered across nations and hidden in stories, what would it take for us to recognize them, and through them to see the empire that history tried to erase? There is a peculiar gravity to an old map. Its parchment yellows with age, the ink fades, yet the names remain like ghosts, whispering of worlds that once were. For kings, scholars, explorers, and traders, these names were real, alive, shaping how they understood the earth. Among those names, one appears again and again, stretching across the heart of Asia in letters so bold that it cannot be overlooked: Tartaria. For centuries it was there, anchoring the imagination of Europe and beyond, and then, by the 19th century, it was gone, as if every cartographer had conspired to erase it. The record of maps becomes a record of disappearance. In the sumptuous atlases of Joan Bleu, in the precise charts of Jodocus Hondius, in the careful delineations of Guillaume de Lille, Tartaria sprawls across half a continent. It was not a vague margin note. It was divided and subdivided: Great Tartari, Chinese Tartari, Independent Tartari, Muscovite Tartari. These categories suggest confidence, familiarity, authority. The cartographers did not imagine Tartaria as myth, they mapped it as reality. The Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1771 devotes pages to its description, outlining its people, its climate, its immense reach. Yet when one turns to later editions, the entry is missing. The silence is sudden, unannounced, and so complete that it feels less like evolution and more like redaction, as if the page itself had been rewritten while no one was looking. It is true that names change. Cathay became China, Persia became Iran, Abyssinia became Ethiopia. But these were transitions, acknowledged, explained, discussed. Tartaria's vanishing is of another order. It was not simply renamed, it was obliterated. The word fell from use across atlases, encyclopedias, and scholarly works in unison, replaced not by one name but by many: Russia, Mongolia, China. Scholars call it a geographical convention, an adjustment made as the lands were better understood. Yet why would a convention so embedded in centuries of scholarship collapse so abruptly, across all languages, across all centres of learning? To hold two maps side by side is to confront this dissonance. In one, say, a chart from 1700, Tartaria dominates, ink sprawling over Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia. In the next, printed barely a century later, the word is gone. The rivers are the same, the mountains unchanged, the deserts still stretch across the horizon. But the name, the identity, has been erased. To the eye of modern history, Tartaria never existed. To the ink of centuries, it was undeniable. Which voice do we trust? The silence of the present or the testimony of the past? Some whisper that this was not chance but politics. As the Russian Empire surged eastward, claiming Siberia step by step, it had little use for the name Tartaria. To admit a vast independent power across those lands would undermine its narrative of conquest. Easier to describe the land as wilderness, inhabited by scattered nomads, ripe for civilization. The Qing dynasty, expanding westward into Mongolia and Xinjiang, had similar motives. Why acknowledge Tartaria when the tale of incorporation was so much neater without it? Even Europe, busy with its own colonial ambitions, had no desire to preserve the legacy of a Eurasian rival. A name that once spoke of a great expanse was carved into pieces, each fragment claimed by an empire. In this view, the map is not a mirror of geography, but a weapon. It reshapes perception, erases rivals, creates absence where there was once presence. A border drawn or a name removed is not neutral. It is conquest inscribed on paper. The silence of Tartaria in later atlases is therefore not an accident, but a decision. A silence curated, chosen and enforced until it became the only version of truth. And so the atlases themselves become witnesses to erasure. They show us not only what was known, but what was made to be forgotten. Tartaria's absence is a story in itself, the faint outline of a power so inconvenient it had to be deleted. What does it mean when a name can vanish from every map, every encyclopedia, every record? If Tartaria, inscribed across centuries of charts, could be so thoroughly erased, then how stable are the names we trust today? What if the maps we hold are not the whole story, but only the version permitted to survive? Perhaps Tartaria is not alone. Perhaps the silences between the pages of our atlases conceal other civilizations, other names, other empires folded out of time. What vanished worlds might lie hidden in the white spaces, erased not by nature but by design? And as you run your fingers over the faded ink of an old map, the silence becomes its own kind of testimony. It asks a question that history cannot answer, a question that lingers long after the names have been erased. If Tartaria could vanish so completely, what else has been removed from the record of our world, and how much of our past is still waiting, hidden in the atlases of silence? If an empire can be erased from maps, what becomes of its people? Stones may be renamed, chronicles rewritten, monuments rededicated to foreign rulers. But human beings do not simply vanish. They continue, scattered into new identities, absorbed into other nations, their heritage folded into someone else's story. If Tartaria was once real, then its people must still exist, only hidden, living as the exiles of time. Travel across the immense span of Eurasia, and you will hear echoes of them everywhere. The Tatars of Crimea, the Bashkirs of the Urals, the Kazakhs of the steppe, the Mongols of the east, the Uzbeks, the Chuvash, even smaller tribes like the Mari or the Yakut, all share fragments of memory that suggest a greater whole. Their languages overlap in peculiar ways, their rituals converge, their myths echo one another, and yet in the chronicles of empire they are always treated as separate, scattered peoples, never as the heirs of something vast. What if this separation was the very goal, to fracture a once great identity into fragments that no longer threaten the narratives of those who conquered them? The exiles of Tartaria may not even have known their displacement. A child born after a cataclysm does not remember the empire of his ancestors. He grows into the identity given by the victors. With each generation, memory becomes legend, and legend becomes silence. But silence is never complete. Certain songs sung by nomads on the steppes carry rhythms that scholars trace back thousands of years, older than the modern nations that claim them. Embroideries stitched by village women echo designs found carved into ancient stones. Oral histories speak of migrations from the center of the world, though the center itself is never named. In Russia's chronicles, the Tatars appear largely as enemies, the Golden Horde, the Mongol yoke. In Chinese records, they appear as restless nomads on the frontier, raiders to be contained. In European imagination, they were barbarians on horseback, storms from the east, threats at the edge of the known world. But what if all of these portrayals were distortions, deliberate reductions of a people who once built cities, raised monuments, and carried knowledge now forgotten? What if the conquerors called them marauders precisely to erase the memory of them as rulers? The mystery is not only historical, it is also personal. For millions across Eurasia today, ancestry is tied to peoples once labelled Tartars. Yet when they look into official histories, they find little more than stereotypes of nomads, raiders, or subjects of foreign dynasties. The sense of being cut off from an origin, of having one's past erased, lingers like an ache passed quietly through bloodlines. Families know they come from somewhere, but the where has been sealed away. And perhaps that ache itself is testimony. For while maps can be redrawn and monuments rebranded, the persistence of memory in human beings is harder to erase. It hides in lullabies, in the way communities mark the seasons, in rituals whose meanings have been forgotten but whose motions are still performed. The old horse songs sung on the Kazakh steppe, the throat singing of Tuva, the spiral sun motifs embroidered into Kyrgyz cloth, the seasonal festivals of Bashkir villages. All these may be fragments of a legacy that cannot be named but refuses to die. There are also the ruins that stand silently among them. In remote places, villagers live beside half-buried star forts, their origin attributed vaguely to old builders. In Siberia, colossal walls of stone appear suddenly in the wilderness, the people calling them city ruins, though no history book mentions them. In Central Asia, the tales of vanished capitals, cities of light, cities swallowed by mud, cities hidden beneath the earth, remain in folklore. These ruins, these stories, these patterns are like bones beneath new flesh, traces of a body erased yet still present. Imagine living as an heir to something vast, but never allowed to know its name. Imagine carrying fragments of memory, words, designs, melodies, without the story that binds them. This is the condition of the exiles of time. They are not a vanished people, but a dispersed one. Their empire dissolved, their legacy fragmented, they live on, unknowingly embodying the civilization history tried to bury. And perhaps this is Tartaria's most haunting survival. Not in the stones, not in the maps, but in the people themselves. For while architecture can be claimed and chronicles rewritten, blood carries memory in its own way. Lineages endure, descendants survive. Even when denied the name of their empire, they remain its children. If Tartaria's people became the exiles of time, then their presence today is both haunting and hopeful. Haunting because it suggests we live among the descendants of an empire that we are forbidden to acknowledge. Hopeful because it means Tartaria never truly died. It dissolved into its children, waiting to be remembered. And so we are left with a question that lingers beyond the pages of history books. If we could recognize the children of Tartaria among us, what forgotten truths might they carry in their voices, their blood, their dreams? What if the key to Tartaria is not buried in ruins or hidden in archives, but walking beside us, disguised as Tatars, Bashkirs, Mongols, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, the silent heirs of an empire folded into time? To understand an erasure, one must ask who benefited. The disappearance of Tartaria was not merely a cartographic adjustment, nor only the renaming of territories. It was, in all likelihood, an act of deliberate power. Empires write their authority not only upon land, but upon memory. And when a rival narrative threatens that authority, it must be silenced. Erasure is not the absence of history. It is its rewriting. By the 19th century, Russia was advancing relentlessly eastward, seizing the vastness of Siberia. To admit that these lands had once belonged to a great civilization known as Tartaria would have complicated the story of conquest. Far easier to describe the steppe as wilderness, its people scattered nomads, awaiting the guiding hand of empire. In this narrative, Russia became the bringer of civilization, not its usurper. Its colonization was framed as destiny, not as theft. Tartaria, if acknowledged, would have shattered this narrative, casting Russia not as creator, but as inheritor, perhaps even as destroyer. The Qing dynasty in China had similar motives. As they expanded into Mongolia and Xinjiang, they encountered lands that older maps had boldly labelled Tartary. But for the Qing, legitimacy required framing their expansion as natural integration, not the annexation of a rival power. To acknowledge Tartaria would have created a dual history, one in which the Qing were not consolidators, but conquerors. Thus the old name was buried. The people became subjects. Their local rulers were rebranded as tribal chiefs. Their histories were absorbed into the grand quilt of the Middle Kingdom. Tartaria dissolved into China's narrative of unity. Even in the West, silence proved useful. Europe was busily redrawing the globe through voyages, exploration, colonization. To admit that a vast and advanced empire had sprawled across Asia, unacknowledged in their chronicles, would have destabilized their claim to discovery. Europe's power depended on the idea that the world was revealed only when they recorded it. If Tartaria existed, their narrative of exploration would be fractured, their arrogance unsettled. Better then to reduce Tartaria to a vague term, a phantom land, an error of geography corrected by better knowledge. Thus, Western atlases quietly erased it, treating centuries of cartographic certainty as a careless mistake. And so, through maps and textbooks, through libraries and classrooms, the script of the erasers was written. Tartaria did not fall with a single battle. It did not collapse with a single disaster. Its greatest defeat was to be forgotten, overwritten by new empires whose authority demanded a clean slate. The chronicles of the past were revised, libraries reorganized, atlases reprinted. By the end of the 19th century, the silence was nearly complete. Tartaria had become a ghost without a grave. Yet erasures are never perfect. They leave behind seams, fractures, inconsistencies. A trace of ink lingers in the margins of an old map. A name slips into a traveller's diary. A building refuses to conform to the architectural style ascribed to it. These anomalies betray the script, hinting at what lies beneath. They are like cracks in a painted wall through which the older mural can still be glimpsed. And perhaps it is in these cracks that the truth of Tartaria waits, fragments overlooked by those who sought to conceal them. We must ask, was the erasure of Tartaria merely a byproduct of empire or something more deliberate, more coordinated? Did rulers across Russia, China, and Europe conspire, consciously or unconsciously, to suppress memory? Or did silence spread in a subtler way, the way absence fills a void when no one chooses to remember? History is not only what is written, but what is allowed to be repeated. Perhaps Tartaria was forbidden repetition. The questions remain unanswered, and perhaps they always will. But they remind us of a simple truth. History is never neutral. It is written by those with something to gain and erased by those with something to lose. What survives is not the whole story, but the chosen story. Each atlas, each textbook, each chronicle is less a mirror of reality than a weapon of narrative, designed to shape the perception of those who come after. If Tartaria was erased by design, what does that tell us about the histories we accept today? How many of the truths we hold as permanent are simply the victories of one narrative over another? How many silences have we mistaken for absence when they are really the scars of erasure? Perhaps the most unsettling thought is this, that we carry within us the memories of silenced histories without names. We inherit rituals, songs, and ruins whose origins we cannot trace because the script of the erasers cut them away. Our present identity may itself be built upon foundations deliberately obscured. The script of the erasers is not a closed book. It continues, quietly shaping how we see the past, determining which voices are amplified and which are muted. To read between its lines requires humility, the recognition that history is not certainty, but choice, and so we arrive at a lingering question. If the silence of Tartaria is the work of erasure, how many other civilizations have vanished not because they were weak, but because they were inconvenient? How many names have been lost? How many empires hidden, because their memory did not serve the powers that followed? What if the story of humanity is not one of steady progress, but of constant rewriting? Victories of ink over memory, silences over voices, erasures over truth? And if this is so, how do we begin to read differently, not only the words inscribed, but the absences between them, the gaps that hint at what was removed? If Tartaria was truly erased, then traces of its presence should linger not only in remote ruins or forgotten maps, but in the very heart of the cities we still walk today. Capitals, after all, are rarely built from nothing. They rise upon older foundations, inherit stones from prior civilizations, and carry forward the legacies of those who came before. Look closely enough, and the past emerges beneath the surface, shimmering like a ghost beneath new paint. Take St. Petersburg. Founded by Peter the Great in the early 18th century, it is celebrated as the triumph of Russian ambition, a city raised miraculously from swamp and vision. Yet its scale and architecture feel oddly out of place for a fledgling empire. Endless boulevards stretch with uncanny precision. Colonnades of monumental stone appear as if conjured from nowhere. Palaces line the Neva, so vast in their construction that even today they overwhelm. Official history assures us this was the work of a new empire in its infancy. But can such magnificence truly have been erected in only a generation? The story strains belief. Some whisper that Peter did not build from nothing, but inherited something already there, structures rebranded as his creation, foundations belonging to another age. In this telling, the birth of St. Petersburg was not a beginning, but a rebirth, the reawakening of a Tartarian capital buried beneath time and mud. Moscow, too, brims with anomalies. The Kremlin rises at its heart, a fortress of layered styles. Byzantine domes, Italianate walls, Soviet stars. It looks less like a unified vision and more like a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped and rewritten again and again. Legends speak of tunnels running beneath its stones, leading to hidden chambers whose origins no one can explain. Some say these tunnels are remnants of an earlier sovereignty, chambers of rulers whose memory has been erased. To stand before Moscow's onion domes is to see 1,000 years condensed, but perhaps those 1,000 years cover something older still, something we are not told. Travel westward, and Paris offers its own puzzles. The transformation under Baron Haussmann in the 19th century is portrayed as a sudden flowering of modern planning. Wide boulevards, radial symmetry, neoclassical monuments. Yet these designs echo patterns seen across continents, as if following a template older than France itself. Were these truly innovations of a single century, or were they inheritances? Structures adapted, foundations repurposed, facades replaced to fit a narrative of national progress. Could the Paris we know be less a construction of the 19th century and more a reconfiguration of a deeper, more universal architecture whose roots reach back to Tartaria? Across the Atlantic, Washington, D.C. bears whispers of the same lineage, the capital of a young republic, yet designed with uncanny resonance. Star-shaped layouts, obelisks piercing the sky, domes rising like capacitors of stone. The official story points to Enlightenment ideals and Masonic influence, to neoclassical borrowing from Greece and Rome. But the patterns repeat with too much consistency. They echo the geometry of star forts scattered across Eurasia. They align with celestial paths in ways older than the Enlightenment. Some ask, could Washington itself be an inheritor of Tartarian knowledge, its design a continuation rather than an invention, a survival smuggled across oceans by those who carried fragments of a forgotten science? Each capital thus becomes a manuscript written over many times but never fully erased. Like parchment scraped clean, faint lines remain beneath the text, whispering of what came before. Beneath monuments and boulevards may lie older chambers, sealed vaults, entire foundations whose origins do not belong to the narrative we are told. Subways and sewers sometimes unearth walls that predate the city itself. Archaeologists occasionally stumble upon layers of masonry that no record can explain. These are quickly folded into official stories, but perhaps they are cracks through which Tartaria's ghost still breathes. If this is true, then the erasure of Tartaria is not complete. It lingers in plain sight, woven into the fabric of our greatest cities. We walk daily upon its bones, unknowing heirs to an inheritance denied us. The capitals of our age may be standing atop ghost cities, their facades masking a legacy too vast and inconvenient to admit. The arches, domes, and radial streets we admire may not be symbols of our nations at all, but echoes of a world written out of memory, and so the question grows more urgent. If these capitals hide Tartarian ghosts beneath their stones, what might we uncover if we dared to dig deeper? Would we find only ruins, mute remnants of a forgotten empire, or the remains of a knowledge that was never meant to vanish? What would it mean if the greatest achievements of our modern world were not new at all, but inheritances of a civilization erased? To walk in these cities is to move through layers of time. The boulevards and avenues whisper of power, but beneath them lie older foundations, unseen yet unextinguished. Tartaria may not be gone. It may be waiting, sealed within the capitals we take for granted, its silence pressing upward through the stones. If architecture carries the memory of Tartaria, and if cities stand upon its buried bones, then perhaps what lies deeper still is not stone at all, but something stranger. The idea that Tartaria mastered forces beyond our comprehension. Among the most haunting whispers is that their knowledge was not confined to building or engineering, but reached into the fabric of time itself. The legends speak obliquely. Travellers tell of gates that shimmered in the steppe, places where the horizon seemed to bend. Folklore describes towers that vanished overnight as if folded into another world. Even in chronicles of conquest, there are tales of enemy camps that disappeared as dawn broke, leaving only traces in the earth. Are these the inventions of imagination, or fragments of something real? Some theorists suggest that Tartaria possessed a science we might call resonance, a mastery of frequency, geometry, and energy that allowed them to shape not only space, but perhaps time. Domes could focus vibrations, spires could direct currents, star forts could anchor energy grids across continents. To us these look like architecture. To them they may have been portals, devices designed to compress distance or even bend chronology. It is here that the motif of folded time emerges. Just as maps can be folded, overlapping territories into one, so too might history itself be folded, compressing epochs, repeating events, disguising cycles. Could Tartaria have used this knowledge to appear larger than life, to project influence across continents, to slip between eras like shadows in the margins of a book? The speculation feels wild, yet certain anomalies invite it. Reports of vitrified forts, stone fused into glass by unknown heat, suggest technologies that could manipulate energy far beyond fire. Legends of sky chariots among the Tatars echo strangely with descriptions of aerial craft in other cultures. Even the curious way Tartaria lingers in maps long after it's supposedly vanished feels like a fold in the timeline itself, as though reality were reluctant to let it go. If Tartaria wielded such knowledge, then its erasure takes on a new dimension. It was not merely political convenience that demanded silence, but fear. For an empire that could bend time or open portals would be intolerable to the rulers who followed. To erase its memory would not only secure authority over land, but also over the very perception of what is possible. Perhaps this is why Tartaria feels less like a forgotten kingdom and more like a forbidden one. The silence is not only historical, it is protective. A barrier erected against something that unsettles the foundations of reality. And so we are left with a question that is more than historical. If Tartaria truly mastered the folds of time, then where did they go? Did they vanish into their own portals, carrying their empire into another layer of existence? Or do their shadows still move among us, flickering at the edges of our perception, waiting for the fold to open once more? What if the erasure of Tartaria was not the end of a story, but the sealing of a doorway? A doorway that, if opened again, might show us a world where time itself is not what we believe? If Tartaria's knowledge was truly folded away, then perhaps it did not vanish at all. Perhaps it survived, not as an empire upon maps, but as a hidden foundation beneath the world we live in. The possibility is unsettling, that the modern age, with all its monuments and marvels, may be less a story of innovation than one of inheritance, where the silent architects of Tartaria left their mark for us to walk upon without knowing. Look again at the great expositions of the 19th century, the Paris Exposition of 1889, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, vast complexes of domes, towers, and palaces that rose seemingly overnight, built at impossible speed, displayed for a season, and then dismantled as if they were never meant to endure. Historians tell us they were temporary structures of plaster and staff, mere illusions of grandeur. But photographs reveal architecture so monumental, so precise, that the official explanation feels like a dismissal. Could these fairs have been something else? The unveiling of inherited designs, relics of Tartaria paraded before the world, then quietly removed before questions could be asked. The same suspicion lingers in cities across the world. Washington, Paris, London, St. Petersburg. Their boulevards are laid out with geometric precision. Their monuments echo the forms of star forts and energy domes seen elsewhere. Officially, this is the work of masons and engineers inspired by classical ideals. Yet the motifs repeat too neatly, too consistently, across cultures that had no need to imitate one another. It is as if a hidden template guided them all, a blueprint older than the nations themselves. Even our technologies may bear traces of this inheritance. The obsession with electricity in the 19th century, the sudden rise of telegraphy and lighting systems, the spires and towers that dotted skylines, all seem like rediscoveries rather than inventions. Perhaps the machines of Tartaria were not entirely erased, but broken down and repurposed, their secrets hidden beneath new names. What we call progress may in truth be fragments of a legacy too vast to acknowledge. If so, then Tartaria has not vanished. It has been folded into the very fabric of our age. Its knowledge survives in our monuments, in our cities, in the grids of power and light that we take for granted. The empire we were told never existed may in fact be the silent architect of the world we know. But if this is true, then the silence is even more haunting. To live among the ruins of a forgotten empire, to walk daily through its echoes without recognition, is to inhabit a world built upon erasure. And if Tartaria's legacy has been hidden in plain sight, what else might we be overlooking? If the architects of our present were truly the forgotten builders of Tartaria, then how different is our history from the one we are told? And how much of what we call modern might in truth be ancient, left behind by hands we can no longer name? As we follow the faint trail of Tartaria through maps, ruins, myths, and silence, a strange convergence begins to take shape. Threads that seem at first unrelated, star forts etched in the soil, domes that resonate like instruments, stories of floods and erasures, the sudden vanishing of a name from atlases, all begin to weave together into a tapestry. Each piece alone can be explained away. Together they whisper of something more, an empire deliberately folded out of time, yet still present in the stones beneath our feet and the skies above our heads. Stone speaks most clearly. Across continents, structures appear that defy the narrative of their builders. Cathedrals with foundations older than the cities they stand in. Fortresses whose glassy walls suggest technologies of heat and resonance we do not fully understand. Obelisks and towers that seem less like monuments and more like instruments, designed to draw down energy from the atmosphere itself. These structures echo one another across oceans, as though born from a single mind. But the sky too holds its memories. Legends of lights that danced above the steppes, storms that carried fire, towers that glowed in resonance with thunder. Travellers described horizons that shimmered, as if veils of energy were stretched across the land. Even today, anomalies persist. Auroras that appear in unexpected places, ruins that seem to hum during solar storms, unexplained glows caught on film above ancient sites. Perhaps the sky itself remembers, replaying fragments of a world once attuned to its hidden currents. The convergence is unsettling because it resists certainty. Historians insist Tartaria was never real, that it was a phantom of European imagination. Scientists dismiss mudfloods and energy domes as fantasy. Yet the anomalies remain, multiplying rather than fading. And so Tartaria becomes not only a mystery of the past, but a mirror for the present. A reminder that what we call history may be only one version of the story, shaped by those who hold the pen. In stone and in sky, Tartaria still seems to breathe. Its silence is filled with whispers. Its absence is filled with echoes. The empire that should not exist refuses to vanish completely. It lingers in questions, in ruins, in the strange familiarity of patterns that repeat across ages and continents. And so we arrive at the threshold of the final reflection. If Tartaria still speaks in these echoes, if its memory survives in silence, then perhaps erasure is never complete. Perhaps history cannot be destroyed, only folded, waiting for someone to unfold it once more. But if Tartaria's legacy is folded into the present, what might it mean for the future? And what happens when those echoes grow louder, refusing to be ignored? The journey brings us back to quiet. The questions have circled through maps and myths, through towers of stone and whispers of machines, through floods and resets and the strange erasures of time. And now, at the edge of the story, Tartaria still refuses to resolve itself. It lingers, like a presence felt more than seen, breathing in silence. Perhaps this is the true legacy of Tartaria, not a kingdom to be rediscovered, not an empire to be proven with artifacts and dates, but a reminder of how fragile memory is. That history is not a stable ground beneath our feet, but shifting soil, layered, rewritten, buried and revealed again. In that soil, the name Tartaria waits like a seed, dormant, forgotten, yet never entirely dead. When we close our eyes, we can almost see it. Cities rising on the steppe, their domes humming with power. Star forts glowing faintly as storms roll over the horizon. Roads stretching into distance without end, carrying caravans of knowledge from one world to another. Perhaps these images are only dreams. Or perhaps they are memories surfacing, fragments of a story that was meant to be erased but could not be. The silence of Tartaria is not empty. It is filled with echoes, with questions that deepen rather than resolve. What empire could span continents, then vanish without trace? What knowledge could be so dangerous that it demanded erasure? What truths might still lie beneath our streets, beneath our capitals, folded into the architecture of the present? And as we ask, the silence answers only with stillness. Yet in that stillness there is awe. Awe at the possibility that history is vaster than we imagine. Awe at the thought that erasures are never complete. Awe at the sense that we are not only inheritors of the histories we are told, but of the silences that remain unspoken. So let Tartaria remain what it is, an empire erased and yet enduring, a ghost folded into time, breathing quietly in the margins of our world. Perhaps it is not for us to uncover it fully, but simply to listen, to stand in the hush of night, and to recognize that silence itself can carry memory. And now, as the story fades into quiet once more, I leave you with the question that lingers beyond all others. If Tartaria still breathes in silence, then what else lies hidden, waiting to be remembered? Where are you listening from tonight, and what hour has found you in the company of forgotten empires?